We began a series of lessons a couple of weeks ago last week actually, on the prayers of Jesus. And one of the things that we noted is that sometimes the Bible just says Jesus prayed. And from those, I think we can gain great insights. Now, we're not going to uh, shatter the earth, and admittedly, my assumptions may not be your assumptions, and we have to automatically say that some of these things are assumptions, and we'll highlight those when we get to them. But Jesus, it says about 30 different times in the text in the Bible that we have that he prayed, but yet a good portion of those, probably 2/3 of those, we don't have prayers at all. And of the ones we have, we may not have all of. We may have part of it. But it is really from the prayers of Jesus that we can learn a lot. If you just think about when they happened or what was going on, if you will, around them, if you kind of couch them within the activities that are going on, knowing that even when we couch them within the activities, if you stop and think about it, we can say, well, this happened about this time, and I'll show you in just a minute what I'm talking about. But then we have to assume, well, all of that happened maybe within that week. Maybe it did, and maybe it didn't. We don't really know because we don't have just a day-to-day diary, of Jesus. And so when we talk about some of the fit them within the context of what we have, there may have been a space in between them, and we may say, well, the way it reads is just together, and we'll see that. We want to talk about, first of all, as we learn from Jesus' prayers, we learn not only when he prayed, and sometimes we learn what he prayed for, but we learn where he prayed. And sometimes that's good too, and we learn about the situation at the time. Let me show you what I want to talk about tonight. We'll look at 3 passages at the beginning. If we have time, we'll look at another topic. But let's begin in Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Mark chapter 1, verse 35. Understand that this is Galilee. This is Jesus' first preaching tour. He's basically on his way to Capernaum when Mark chapter 1, verse 35 happens. It's around AD 27, so it's right at the beginning of his ministry. And the text just simply says, in the morning, having risen a long while before daylight, he went out and departed to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Now, several things had happened around this time. Jesus had talked to the woman at the well in John 4. He had healed the nobleman. The nobleman's son, He had healed a demonic. Peter's mother-in-law. He'd healed a lot of folks. There'd been a lot of, if you will, miracles of Jesus that were around this time in Mark chapter 1. And notice what it tells us about his praying, that it was a long while before daylight. Now, how long, Mark doesn't say, and this is really the only account of this that we have. Mark says that you could say it's still dark outside, and before daylight hits, Jesus gets up, and what does he do? He goes to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Now, having said that, you might want to mark that in your mind. Let's look in Luke chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 15 and 16. This is a different time. It is in Galilee. It is AD 27, we believe, and so it's around the time, but it's probably after Mark chapter 1. Jesus has just healed some lepers, if you see the text there. And it's a short time after that, and it's a short time after Mark chapter 1, after Jesus has healed these lepers. If you look in Luke chapter 5, verse 15 and 16, it says, however, the report went around concerning him all the more, and great multitudes came together to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. So he himself often withdrew into the wilderness and prayed. So imagine several things have happened. If you think about what we said in Mark chapter 1, Jesus had healed several folks. Now all of a sudden word is getting out who Jesus is, what he can do, the power that he has. And so there are more people, by the time we get to Luke chapter 5, there are more people that are beginning to want to go see what's going on, want to probably have healing themselves or bringing someone that they love to heal. And Jesus himself, notice that it says he often during that time withdrew himself into the wilderness. Now, we often think of wilderness as wild kingdom, lions and tigers and stuff like that. Understand, wilderness here just really means not around civilization, not around a town. Now, we might call it this way. He just went out in the country, just went out a little ways, but he went by himself and he prayed. Now we're going to add one more to this. Look in Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. We're going to look in verse 23. This is the feeding of the 5,000. This is also found in Luke chapter 6, by the way. But I wanted you to see what Matthew says in Matthew 14. And if you think about Jesus feeding, this is where Jesus takes 5 loaves, 2 fishes, he feeds 5,000 men. Now remember that one of the reasons that Jesus really had to perform the miracle if the folks were going to eat is that they had been with him all day. They've been with him for a long time. They hadn't had anything to eat. Jesus is concerned about them. He just doesn't want to send them out. Good luck. Go find what you can. He decides, sit the people down. What do we got? And 5 loaves, 2 fishes are brought out by a little boy. And Jesus feeds these 5,000 individuals. And then look down. Well, let's look beginning in verse 22. Paragraph begins there. Matthew 14, verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. They're right there. And so he's get them to go across the Sea of Galilee. And he says, and when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. All 3 passages at different times, various times, basically tell us one idea. Jesus prayed in solitude. Now, that's not to say, and that's not to condemn, public prayers. Matter of fact, the Bible teaches us that we are to pray publicly. From the standpoint of like church, we pray publicly. It's all right to pray in public, like if you go to a restaurant and you and your family, if you wish to bow your head and say a prayer, nothing wrong with that. If you go back to Matthew, it's the pretense and not the prayer that's the problem with some folks, with Pharisees. But Jesus prayed by himself in solitude. Now, we can ask the question, well, did Jesus answer this prayer? We don't know, because we don't know what all he was praying for. We might also ask the question, was what was said in some of these prayers? We don't know. We have no way of knowing because the text doesn't tell us. Well, let's make 2 or 3 assumptions about some things here, just so that as we speculate, as we come to get to know Jesus and to know about his prayer life, we get some thoughts really by virtue here of timing. Jesus prayed at a time in which his popularity was rising, and Matthew 14 when it was at an all-time high. But yet Jesus found time to go and pray in solitude. Now, what was he asking for? Well, like I say, who knows? Strength? Humility? Maybe both. Think about his prayer at the beginning of his ministry, the one in Mark chapter 1 especially. Think about the fact that while he knew what was going to happen, the lack of energy, the fact that folks would sap it from him by their presence, and by we think about how much power left him in his miracles. Well, the text really doesn't allow us or seem to direct our thoughts in the fact that, sort of like superheroes, sometimes they get weak because they've used all their powers for the day. Doesn't seem Jesus had that problem. But at the same time, too, Jesus probably, from a standpoint of physically, was drained dealing with people all day long. I can tell you personally that by the time I've taught Bible class and preached Sunday morning and gone out to NHC Sunday afternoon and preached Sunday night, I'm drained by the end of the day. And I'm sure Jesus was the same way. And so he may have prayed for strength. He may have prayed for humility. But think about this. Jesus went in private to pray. Now we have other examples. Isaac in Genesis 24, Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4 prayed in solitude. Jesus wasn't the first one to do this. But what's the advantages to praying in solitude? What's the advantages to, say, us getting up in the mornings before anyone gets up in the house and spending time in prayer? Or if we're a late night person, waiting till everybody goes to bed and spending time in purposeful prayer. What does it do? Well, we understand that it avoids distractions. I said it was the what Jesus was condemning in Matthew 6 was not prayer and public prayer, but was the pretense. Look in Matthew 6. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. I personally, and this is a side note, I think that the Sermon on the Mount has more to say about prayer probably than the rest of his sermons that we know that he preached. There's just several different passages in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 that either directly address or allude to the subject of prayer. And Jesus dealt with prayer really more so than any one other subject in especially the Sermon on the Mount. But Jesus, beginning in Matthew 6, talks about don't do your religion, if you will, in front of people to be seen of people. And he talks about the giving of alms, beginning in the first 4 verses. And then he changes to prayer. And in verse 5 of Matthew chapter 6, he says, and when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites. Now, the hypocrites, remember, we've talked about it before, as well, being good Bible students. The Greek word hypocrites just simply means actors. Hypocrite's an actor. He acts religious, but he's really not. He acts spiritual, but he's really not. It's sort of like we had a young man when I was in West Kentucky. He came one Sunday. We were considering him for a summer intern, and he came and he gave a talk, he preached for us that morning. And the story he told of himself was one of those, and I thought, I interviewed you before you came, and what I'm hearing, it doesn't go along. But everybody, they were so convinced. But the elders, thankfully, they had talked to me, and they had come to the conclusion after he got through that some of that just didn't match up. So we hired somebody else. Folks weren't very happy about it, but we hired somebody else. Well, sure enough, a few weeks later, we heard the boy had gotten caught in his lie and had made his trouble, but he made it sound like he'd come from virtually nothing, and now here he was, a spiritual giant. He's still pretty much nothing, unfortunately. He hadn't changed his ways. He was a hypocrite. He played the role, but he really wasn't. Well, Jesus says, when you pray, I don't want you to be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and the corners of the streets that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say unto you, they have their reward. Now, think about what he says there for just a second. He says, here you've got these hypocrites, and he's dealing with them with the idea of prayer, or with the idea of giving, the first 4 verses, then with prayer, and then he'll move verse 16 to the idea of fasting. It was Pharisees, most notably. Not all of them, just some of them. But they were doing their religion, they were doing their practice, if you will, not because they were spiritual of nature, but because they wanted to be seen of men. And so the first 4 verses talks about the individual that holds his money up and shouts because you had to go to the front to give you money. No, we do it when you come in the back door. But they, in first century, there would be what looked to be sort of like an inverted trumpet sitting up, kind of have the bell of the trumpet, if you will, up in the air, and you would go up and you'd carry your money and you'd place it in that, for lack of a better term, basket, and you turn around and you'd go to your place. Well, they would do it. They'd bring it in, they'd hold it up, and they'd turn around 2 or 3 times while they were walking down the aisle, and some of them, according to historians, some of them that had money would even pay some people off, a little payola. Oh, shout for me when I go down, if you don't mind. And so some of them, 1 or 2, shout for them. Oh, look at brother so-and-so. And Jesus said, we don't do that. Well, he talks about now, he says, you need to understand that there are some folks that love to get in the middle of the synagogue, and they love to throw out those arms and throw that head back, and they like to offer up that prayer, sort of like the publican and Pharisee. Remember that story? They throw it back so that people will think, oh, look at Brother Smith, isn't he religious? And notice what Jesus says. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. What's their reward? Folks talking about them. Folks pointing at them. But, he says, look at verse 6, and this is the one we really want to look at. But you, when you pray, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, or in the secret place. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Think about what he says. He says, go in your room and you shut and you pray to your Father, and you pray to him in secret. Now, once again, like we said, the Bible does not condemn public prayer. Jesus is just trying to make sure these folks practice their faith based upon true spirituality. And he says, so when you go into your inner room, it's interesting, back I think it's in the 70s and 80s especially. Now some houses that are built have safe rooms, right? You can go, usually kind of in the middle of the house, and it's safe. You can go in, lock yourself in. Nobody can get to you. Nobody can do anything. Nobody can harm you. But in the 70s, there were models of houses that people would build these houses, they'd build just a small room, really just a closet. Some of them you'd almost just back into, really. And that was their prayer room. And that's where they'd go to pray. Well, Jesus says, you go into your room. Notice what he says. He says, shut your door and pray to your Father who's in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly. Notice the contrast. The contrast of verse 5 is these folks that are praying in public just to be seen of men, they'll have their reward, but you go to your quiet place and you pray. God will reward you, and he'll reward you openly. And then he talks about don't use vain repetition or The idea of vain repetition is the idea of empty words, as the heathen do, for they think they'll be heard because of their much speaking. Therefore, do not like them, for your Father knows the things that you have need of before you ask him. And so he deals with the idea of prayer. Prayer with simplicity, pray with sincerity, pray with security, knowing that God will hear you. It's great message there. But when you think about what does prayer do by being in solitude, why did Jesus get up early in the morning? Well, he avoided the distractions of people. He avoided the distractions of what was going on. And he was able really to have a true heart to heart with God. Look in 1 Kings 8. There's an interesting passage, and I had forgotten it until I got to studying again today. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 39. If you look in 1 Kings 8, Solomon, if you look beginning in verse 1, Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes of its fathers, children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion. The temple is finished, and it's a dedication of the temple, and bringing up, of course, the altar, the final act in filling the temple. And in 1 Samuel 8, verse 39, that's the verse I want to look at. Let's go back to verse 37, if you don't mind, because that's the paragraph. When there is famine in the land, pestilence or blight or mildew, locusts or grasshoppers, when their enemies besieges them in the land of their cities, whatever plague or whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever supplication is made by anyone or by all your people Israel, when each one knows the plague of his own heart and spreads out his hands toward this temple, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive. He's beseeching God. Here in your dwelling place and forgive and act and give to everyone according to all of his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men. When we spend time in prayer, we're praying in solitude, and usually when we get to that point, we're praying out of need, right? We get to that point, we're not really praying out of thanksgiving. Now, there's times for prayers of thanksgiving. There's times for prayers of need. But when we get to the point where we're praying so fervently, we just want a heart-to-heart with God. We're praying out of need. But entering into that closet, being in that quiet place, being in that time in which we're in that quiet place with God, we're able to have a heart-to-heart more so than if we're out in public. You see, sometimes our public prayers, led by wonderful, wonderful, godly men, we use platitudes, we use thoughts that maybe in our own private prayers we don't use. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not condemning it at all. I'm just saying that from a personal standpoint, maybe we're able to get a little more personal with God in those quiet times. We're able also, when we pray in solitude, thirdly, to collect our thoughts. We need quiet times. We need times where we can collect our thoughts. We live in a very noisy society. TV's always on. What's the first thing you do? First thing when we get home tonight, probably one of the first things we'll do is turn on the TV. It's just what we do. We'll get in the car. Probably go get her some gas because she needs some. We're in her car. But the radio will be on. And between those two, and then when we get home, like say that we'll probably be reading something, or she'll be looking at the internet, or she'll call her sister tonight, and so there'll be a conversation between those two tonight. But we live in very noisy times. And as I said, 2-3 weeks ago, I like noise. I sit in my office. I have something on. I have a radio on. I have a fan on. I have a heater on. I have something on. I have to have the noise. If it gets too quiet, I can't think. Because I know what it is. It's because when that stuff begins to roll around, there's an echo in there because it's hollow. There's nothing up there. And so consequently, I have to have a little noise. Well, I have to have time, you have to have time. We all have to have time to collect our thoughts. And praying in solitude does that for us. And fourthly, it allows us to get alone in the presence of God. Often we're drained. We know God's there. And according to Acts 17, we know He's waiting. He's waiting for us. Jeremiah 33:3 is probably the best. It says, "Call upon me and I will answer." It seems as if you go back and read the context there, as if God is simply sitting there with His ear bent, waiting on us to call to Him. And so when we begin to pray in solitude, we're able to get that heart to heart, and we're able to get alone in His presence and let Him hear us. But then a second possibility, Jesus praying in solitude. Why did He pray in solitude? To be rejuvenated. As we said, He could have been tired from the trip, the Mark 1 passage from the trip, from some of the activities of the day, especially by the time He's feeding the 5,000, Matthew chapter 14. And maybe He prayed just so that God would give Him strength. You know, as far as we know, Jesus never took a vacation. He didn't take 2 weeks vacation. He didn't have 6 holidays to take. Now that's not to say that He didn't rest. And that's not to say that He didn't separate Himself from people at times and rest. But He didn't take an extended period of time and on a regular interval. Prayer allows us that time to find that strength for help, find that inward renewal, if you will, when life wears and tears upon us. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. You know this passage very well once we get to it and you read it. It talks about the Father of mercies. Blessed be the God and Father. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. I imagine in those quiet times, whereas, remember the passage that said He did this often, that He was going there not only for strength, but for inward renewal. The problems of life, the pushing in of the Pharisees and Sadducees of His day, the people that were questioning Him. You see, I think we imagine the picture of Jesus one way, and it might have been, but it might not always have been. Now, what in the world are you talking about, Paul? We picture sort of like the way the movies picture Jesus. You know, He's walking, and He's walking at a leisurely pace, and He's just spitting out these little lessons as He goes. And it just comes with ease. And He sits down and He talks to people in a very nice, monotone sense. Jesus was fiery. He cleansed the temple not once, but twice. Jesus could get with it if He needed to. Jesus had a sense of not what I'd call comedic relief, but He had a sense in which, if you think about it in Matthew, where He talks to the Pharisees and then the Sadducees, and then the Pharisees come back at Him again, Matthew 23, and then the Pharisees the Sadducees come back, and it's back and forth for a little while there. And you remember He talks to them, and He talks about how that they're whited sepulchres. Jesus came at these folks. And I'm not so sure it was all just kind of laid back, simple way of going. But Jesus, when He got out in His prayer time, quiet time, He found the God of all comfort. the God that he needed. And so he got his strength to get through the day, get through the miracles, to get through the travel, to get through the people. He knew that God would give him that strength. And so he prayed in solitude. But a third reason why he may have prayed in solitude was strength, or asked, maybe we should say, in solitude, was strength to resist temptation. Interesting, isn't it? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. Don't know what it was. I mean, I know there's been speculation. Some have said it was his appearance. Some have said that it was his eyesight. There's been all sorts of speculation. I have no idea. Paul doesn't specify what his problem was. He just tells us basically he had a problem, and he had asked the Lord 3 times that it might be removed, and God's answer was, no, my grace is sufficient for you. But think about what Paul says when he talks about that in verse 7. Paul says that out of the abundance of revelation there was given to me a thorn in flesh. Why, Paul? He says, lest I should be exalted above measure through the revelation there was given me a thorn in flesh. In other words, God wanted to make sure that I stayed humble. God wanted to make sure that I stayed down to earth. Because none of us would deny the abundance of the revelation which Paul did receive, right? When Paul makes that statement in 2 Corinthians 12, we could say, yeah, because think about, Paul had, by 2 Corinthians, Paul had written 1st, 2nd Thessalonians. Paul had written, he had written Romans. He had written 1 Corinthians, Galatians. Paul had written a great deal by that time. And folks were turning to him for answers, and he was answering really for God to those people. And so God had used him. And Paul says, my thorn in the flesh was keep me humble, keep me down to earth. I wonder, with Jesus being 100% man, yes, God, but I wonder if Jesus' prayer time wasn't a way in which it helped him keep himself humble. It's a thought. I don't know. I don't have an answer for it from this text. But yet Jesus found time to pray in solitude. And I think therein lies part of the beauty of praying in solitude. The opportunities that it affords us, what it gives us time to do. Solitude is an interesting study. Back a few years ago, there were a lot of people that were beginning to study, especially the younger adults, were beginning to study self-disciplines, prayer, solitude, fasting, spiritual disciplines in order to improve their spiritual life. A lot of fascinating books were rewritten and reprinted from days gone by. I have a book in my office celebrating discipleship by a fellow by the name of Foster. It's an old book, but it's actually reprinted. And he talks about solitude. And it's a fascinating chapter, but it reminds me of a friend of mine that preached a sermon on solitude, quietness. He had PowerPoint, and about the first 15 or 20 minutes of his sermon, he didn't say a word. They just turned on the PowerPoint. He had all the slides fixed. You had, of course, to be able to read. And I told him, I said, there's where your problem lies with the sermon, is because if you have someone in your audience that's either too little to read, or as I have had folks that couldn't read, even as adults. And I said that would be, and he admitted that was a problem. But for like, say, about the first 15 or 20 minutes of his sermon, he just rolled those slides with basically the sermon on it, so to speak. And then he broke the silence. And he was trying to teach them the power of silence and solitude. It's a good thought. Anything else? Yeah.
Public prayers about the Jewish religion back then.
Yeah.
Were there designated times?
10, 2, and 4. We're like Dr. Pepper.
I know that they're supposed to go, if they could, to the
Yeah.
temple. You know, we talked
Yeah.
about that. We talked about the temple courts and stuff like that. Was that open like every day?
Mm-hmm.
So you could go either turn in your donation, turn in your whatever, pray.
Mhm.
But I'm getting from what Jesus is saying, all that stuff that was done in the public, I was also going to compare with your future neighbors about everything pointing toward the east.
Yep.
They're having their designated times, whichever one of those religions started that first. That maybe Jesus is saying with this New Testament, but which some of them knew, not everybody knew. It's more about what you do and not what you do in front of other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You got it. You got it.
I found a way, but I didn't know.
Yeah, you got it. That's the whole point, really, of the first 20 verses, as we have of Matthew 6. The Sermon on the Mount fits together beautifully. It's wonderful. I didn't hear what 2 years ago we talked about the Beatitudes, but it would have been fun to really just kind of gone through it and looked at each point as it's presented. But yeah, the biggest portion of Matthew 6 is the idea of true spirituality is between you and God. It's not between you and the people around you. Anything else? Well, I am long-winded because I have two others here that I wanted to get to. Let me say this, and I want to share with you something, and you all can tell me if I was wrong or right on this deal. But what we're going to do next is we're going to look at Luke 6. It's also found in Mark 3, but it's Jesus prays before he chooses the 12 apostles. And I'll probably do 2 next week. And then we'll do Matthew 17, Jesus at Transfiguration. And we'll see some points from the Transfiguration. So I'm trying to incorporate different thoughts into these things. And so anyway, okay. Having concluded that, let me share with you something that happened. And like I say, I guess I kind of would like your input. And so I'm not really preaching, I'm just talking. Last Thursday, I believe it was. Last Thursday, I pulled up Thursday morning into the parking lot, as I always do around 8 o'clock. And I noticed a car up here. Well, there's cars, Jim will tell you, there's cars all the time here. And anyway, there was just barely enough room to pull in, as I do, because I park back here and come in the back door. And so I just pulled by the car. I think I threw up my hand and I pulled in. So I was getting out of the car, and this was, if you recall, it was very windy that day. There was a young girl who jumped out of the car, and I'd say she was probably 20, 21, somewhere in that. She's young. Anyway, I was talking to her, and she was very nervous. Young girl. The end result was, or what happened was, her car, she had the oil changed the day before, and where she had the oil changed, they put the wrong oil filter on it. And by the time she had driven it home that evening and then drove it, she got this far, and she had no oil in her car, and she had panicked, and she was panicking. Anyway, I talked to her for a while. I asked her, I said, "Do you have somebody coming to get you?" "Yes, I do." "Okay, good." "Do you have a way to, somebody going to take care of your car?" "Yes, my daddy." "Okay, not a problem." So we talked. She was very, very nice. And I was, like I say, trying to calm her down. I was trying to be more like her daddy than anything else. And so as I talked to her, I noticed some things. I noticed she had a very small tattoo of hearts with the arrow through them right here under her eye. I noticed she had several piercings, lips, tongue, or lips, nose, ears. And so anyway, I did her what I do with just about everybody I come in contact with. I invited her to church. And she thanked me. And she said, I don't know about coming. And I said, okay. And so she said, I'm different. And I said, yeah, we all are too, River Road. And she said, well, if you can't notice. And I said, I've noticed. And she said, well, people talk about that. And I said, and I told her, I said, that's their problem. That's not your problem. And so she began to cry, bless her heart. And I can't tell you everything that was said, but it just reminded me, I don't know that she'll ever come. I was hoping she would come last Sunday, but she didn't. She might come next Sunday. Who knows? Who knows? It might be 6 years from now before she comes to church, if she ever does. But it just reminds us of the fact that we are all different. Because here's what I told her when she said, I'm different. And I said, well, me too. And she looked at me kind of strange. And I said, I don't have any hair. And so she kind of laughed. And so as we got into the conversation, I asked her, I said, what do you do? Do you go to school? What do you do? Yeah, I go to school. What do you go to school for? I go to cosmetology school. I said, well, I can't help you there. And we laughed about that. She laughed about that. But then I saw her again that afternoon. I came back. I had gone somewhere anyway, at lunch and somewhere else. But I came in and her dad had come and fixed her car. And I had told her, I said, tell Dad to get the car before it gets dark. I said, things happen here. I said, we don't like it, but they do. And she promised me that he would, and he did. He was very nice. Talked to him. He worked for TVA. But it just reminds me of the fact that we are all different. And if we have somebody that walks through those doors that is different, and I know you all would, but it just reminds us that we need to be welcoming to those individuals, and we need to be kind and tender and compassionate, because that's what Jesus was. And so we're all different. And if you stop and think about it, we're all different. Every one of us. We're all unique. Fingerprints. They're different. But we're different from the way we think, the way we talk, to the way we dress, the way we look. I mean, we don't all look alike. Some are short, some are tall, some are fat, some are skinny, some are healthy, some are not healthy. All of those things. So what I want to know is, did I do wrong? Did I say wrong? It hadn't bothered me because I believe it's true. I know. But it does remind us we're all different. Think about the differences in it when they baptized 3,000 folks at Pentecost. Think about the differences of the people there. Spiritual attainment, knowledge, looks, where they were in their life. Some probably had lived a pretty straight life, straight arrow life. Some were coming from some pretty dark pasts. We need to be mindful of that. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, for the blessings of it, thankful for the opportunity that we have to study your word, and for the fact that we do have your word. We're thankful for the example of Jesus and the avenue of prayer that we can come, and we can come to you in private, and we can tell you our burdens, and we can tell you our joys, and we can tell you our needs, and we know that you'll hear, that you'll listen, and that you'll answer accordingly. We ask that you be with individuals that we know of that we love, be with Miss Julia's family as they go through this difficult time, but be with each of us that we may be the type of individuals that you would have us to be, that we may be as you charged Abram in our devotional, that we may walk before you blameless. Be with us now, watch over us, bless us, and keep us. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. We'll talk to you later.